When discussing such a complicated process as is the rise of China economically and politically, we believe that the oppositional burden of proof in this debate is to show us in front of God and the people that the situation was better for the world and for China if the rise of China had never happened. And we, as the side of proposition in this debate, are going to refute this in the best way we can. How is this going to go down? In my speech, you're going to hear two arguments. First one is going to describe the rise of China as an economic process in two layers, where I will display the benefits for China and the benefits for the world that have risen from the rise of China as an economic process. And in my second argument, I'm going to show you how the rise of China has resulted in one of the most important geopolitical stabilizers this world has ever seen. Luca will tell you our third argument, and that will be it from the proposition of this debate. So let's get started. The rise of China as an economic process has affected billions and billions of people. But what does this mean? What does this mean concretely for China? What benefits are apparent exclusively from the process of economic rising? Well, let's get on to my first argument, and the first here, China. Two main great benefits have actually risen from this process for China. China has fed over 680 million people due to the process of China rising. Not fed, not just giving them employment. They have lifted 680 million people above the poverty line, giving them homes, giving them jobs, giving them a future, exclusively because of this process of China economical rising. The second benefit is that due to this process, China has the fastest growing middle class in the world. What does this concretely mean for the economical sphere? It means that because you have the fastest growing middle class, you have the fastest growing expenses. People are buying more, people are spending more money. What does this cause? This causes fluctuation of money inside the state and outside, which we'll talk about in the second part of this argument, and it coherently causes economical stability inside the China and its infrastructure. So, based on the economical factors, China has had two major benefits: rising and giving future to 680 million people, and ensuring economical stability in the situation nowadays. No, thank you. But what about the world? What about the trades, imports, exports? How did the economic rise of China impact the world? Well, for starters, China is the second largest trade partner of the US, the main exporter to Russia, the main exporter to the EU, the main import partner of Brazil, the importer of accounting of 53% of GDP of DR Congo, the main importer on the world, and by some predictions, no thank you, by The Economist, by 2020 China will surpass China's economy will surpass the US's and become the largest economy in the world. This shows us two things, these numbers. How do we put them in perspective? First of all, these numbers show how vital trade with China to the world actually is. How much we interact with them in the trade world, and how vital China as a trade partner to the rest of the world actually is. And B, this is due to the rise of China. This is due to the economical process of rising to a superpower, let's say, in this economical sphere. But in China's interest, because it's still a growing country, China's interest is to have a stable surroundings in which to flourish, because yes, they still highly depend on trade, and they are, no thank you, they're vowing for fair trade purposes. They're vowing for everyone to have a stable environment economically to grow in, and this is why China actually has social economical policies that help out those in need and that help out those countries during, for example, crises. For example, during the 2008 crisis, Chinese loans were the cheapest on the markets, subsequently helping out a lot of countries, which diminished the effects of the recession. frequently loans money to Africa, and recently forgave $10 billion of debt to several African countries. What does this mean? It means that yes, China sees that Africa needs space to evolve, and China sees that Africa is in dire need of help, and China is willing to give this help to them. No, thank you. And of course, set up with the UN, Chinese Development Plan Bank to help struggling countries. And this is the kind of social, economical, politics we are looking for. And because, no, thank you, because there are apparent benefits that affect billions and hundreds of millions of people in China, and that inherently affect beneficially the whole of the world, we believe that from an economical perspective, we support the rise of China. Goes through.
By giving aid to African countries like Sudan and Kenya, you're legitimizing oppressive leaders within those nations. How is that a good thing?
This will be refuted during the course of this debate, because as we have seen, and as we will argue throughout this debate, if the attacks going this way, that no political systems have no place in this debate. Political systems don't have a say in and aren't really important factors when talking about economic and geopolitical growth. The rise of China, because it is necessary for China as a massive country encompassing 1.4 billion people, it's necessary for them to have a stable environment in which they can trade with everyone freely. Thus, Chinese policies, Chinese international policies, are gathered around the idea that, well, war is really bad for trade. War tends to be really bad for trade, no thank you. International conflicts tend to be really bad for trade. Let's not do it. Let's not engage in war. Let's not look into what other countries are doing. Let's not get mixed up in their international politics. Let's work together to have a stable environment in which all of us could flourish. And because of no, thank you. And this is not just because, well, China, because of the present state that China wants to go. Because this is also because China has been wronged in the past. For example, by the Cold War, China felt the consequences on the economies of Europe and Asia. Because of the Cold War, China has experienced them, and China refutes the policies of, for example, several other superpowers, mixing in the policies of other countries, and is absolutely advocating peaceful trade, peaceful coexistence. For example, and we see that China acts on these principles. They sent out back peacekeeping missions all over the world, from South Sudan to Syria. They have the largest number of troops in the UN peacekeeping from all developed countries. China's active diplomacy is fighting for a diplomatic solution of the Syrian situation. China has on 6 occasions vetoed UN's plans to bomb several war-stricken areas because it fights for a diplomatic solution, because it wants to save countless lives and stop further radicalization caused by bombing, because it wants for everyone to prosper, because it wants for everyone to trade freely. And from these two arguments, you see that China has a stable economic policy, that China doesn't think of it of its own, that China behaves according to international deals, according to international policies, and is working together with everyone to make this world a better place. This is why we support the rise of China.
In Niccolo Machiavelli's The Prince, he painted an insidious picture of how governments ought to operate, centering around one very bad principle, that the ends justify the means. This is the problem that sides proposition stands in today's debate. And because we fundamentally reject the words of Machiavelli and believe that the rise of China is the fall of prosperity, we are honored to oppose this motion. I'll be doing 3 things in this speech. Firstly, going over some framing issues. Secondly, putting up some rebuttal on side proposition's case. And then finally, outlining our first 2 substantive arguments, that the rise of China is the decline of social good, and that the rise of China is the rise of political aggression. My second speaker will go over our third argument, that the rise of China is the rise of economic instability. But first, on the framing. Now this plays directly into the burden that side proposition set out for us. They said that we had to show you all today that the world was not better off because of the rise of China. But ladies and gentlemen, what's the motion we're debating today? Are we debating the motion, the rise of China was beneficial to the world? No, we're debating the motion, this House supports the rise of China. And when we support something, the ends of it don't only have to be good, but also the means by which we achieve it. Think of it this way. If a parent's trying to feed a child, but then they sell cocaine and crack to make the money to then feed that child, is that a good thing? We would say no. In order for side proposition to win today's debate, they have to consider not only the ends of China's rise, but also the means by which they achieve them. And we believe that they're failing to do that. Here's the issue on framing. On side proposition, we don't support none. This is what we say. The rise of China has had bad ends, as we are going to show you in their case, but also undeniably been built on the backs of things like slave labor, like pollution, like corruption. And that's the stance that we take in this debate. The two burdens that side proposition has to win is show us not only that the ends are good, but also that the means of China's rise has been good. That's what they have to show you in today's debate. Now, let's move on to some rebuttal. On their first point, they talk to you about the economy, and they separate this into China and the world. Firstly, they tell you in China that they've taken 680 million people out of poverty. But ladies and gentlemen, let's remember, this is out of absolute poverty, not relative poverty. The prices of goods in China have been continuously rising because of the rise of China. So even if they show you that people are making more money, this is far outpaced by the rise in the price of goods. They're not actually solving for poverty, just absolute poverty. Secondly, we tell you when they talk about the middle class, and they talk about how people and this middle class is growing, we say that this is all because of artificial stimulus, which pushes the prices down. The middle class is only growing because in some cases, the government is investing a lot of money to make goods affordable to people. We would say that we're going to respond to this more in our third argument. Secondly, they talked about how China is the main exporter to the world. Two responses to this. Firstly, the reason China is the main exporter to the rest of the world is because their products are so cheap when other people are buying them internationally. And we have to consider, ladies and gentlemen, why this happens. It's because they use things like slave labor, like exploitation, like other horrible practices to push these prices down. And until they show us that these means are good, they're not fulfilling their burden in today's debate. Secondly, we would see that what this is doing is actually taking money away from other international industries. Because now companies or countries are solely buying their goods from China, domestic industries suffer around the world, and that's a bad thing.
Which factory in China is using slave labor?
Literally most of the factories in China. Now let's move on to the point where they talk about Chinese loans in 2008. We would again say that just because China is selling goods to people in an economic crisis doesn't mean that it's necessarily a good thing. This is again taking jobs away from the industries within the nations who need it the most. When countries are in economic crises, they need people within their own nations to invest back into the economy. China is taking all this money, putting this into their own economy. We say that's a bad thing. Finally, they say that China won't be violent, and they won't coerce other nations. But this is a crucial mischaracterization here. Just because China is not violent doesn't mean they won't be coercing other nations. Economic coercion is the primary way by which China goes about this in the world. If you can say to another nation, I'm going to cut off trade with you and take away all the cheap goods I've been giving you, if you don't do what I want, we would say that's a particularly bad thing. We see this in countries like Kenya, where China literally funded all of their power infrastructure, but then, when Kenya didn't agree with the policies of China, they shut down their power completely. They don't coerce through war, they coerce through other means, and that's a bad thing. We're going to be responding to an example of the UN in our own case. So with that being said, let's move on to the opposition. Sorry. Firstly, on the opposition, we would say that the rise of China is the decline of social good. Two layers of analysis here. Firstly, hindering social development internationally. The rise of China poses a greater existential threat to other nations around the world who are fighting for their own democracy and their own liberalization. We would say we see this in countries that they cite in their own case, like Africa and Zimbabwe. China's aid to these nations legitimizes the dictatorships there, and it supports these oppressive regimes, which prevents people, I'll take it in a second, from getting out of these oppressive regimes. We would say that China prevents people from coming from point A, where they're locked up, to point B, where they can actually have a successful life for themselves, because they legitimize these dictators. Go ahead.
We see that China actually has a much better example when dealing with the third world, and they tend to really invest and build infrastructure, unlike the West, which just focuses on political systems. Why is this view better?
Okay, we're not comparing China to the West. What they have to show you is that this investment is a good thing. And at the point at which this investment legitimizes dictators in these countries and is conditional upon these countries doing what China wants, like we give you in the example of Kenya, we would say that this aid isn't a good thing. Second, look to nations like Burma and Syria. In Burma and Syria, China actually blocked UN efforts to curtail despotism and to promote human rights movements. So when they say China is all for human rights, and they cite the example of Syria where they didn't bomb, yeah, they didn't bomb Syria because they wanted to legitimize the government there. That's not a good thing. That's a reason for first-side opposition. Finally, at this point, we would talk to you about censorship. In February of 2009, during the rise of China clearly stated that if you do anything in remote dissension of the government, you'll be locked up. This is anything as simple as critiquing things like faulty water infrastructure, something that literally anyone should be able to complain to their government about. All of these harms came from the rise of China, where they were more aptly equipped to actually demonize their people because they were more powerful. Let's remember one thing. If a country rises, or if a nation rises, independent of the consent of their people, that's not the rise of a nation. That's the rise of a tyrant. And that's what we're opposing on side opposition. Finally, at this point, we will talk to you about human rights. The Uyghur Muslims are a population in China who've been continuously demonized by, literally, in July 2015, 4 Uyghur Muslims were fleeing China, and they actually sent policemen, 10,000 to be exact, to chase after them and catch them and kill them. This population has been continuously demonized and chased out of China, and it only happened because of the rise. Let's move on to our second point, political aggression. This is very straightforward, and I'm sure you all know what I'm going to say. In 1989, the Tiananmen protests took place in China. What they did was when innocent students were protesting against political risks in the government, they brought in tanks and guns and slaughtered every single one of them. We don't think that's a good thing for a nation to do. Secondly, we see this in terms of international influence. We see in economic espionage, Chinese corporations steal things from other countries around the world. They come in right before the patents are set and take the idea and put it in their own domestic industries. This is another reason why goods are so accessible, because they're taking it out from under the nose of international nations. Ultimately, when we analyze today's debate, there's a couple of things you're going to learn. Like Machiavelli said, the ends justify the means. That's what profit does. But that's not their burden today's round. They have to show you that the means are also good and that the ends are good. They failed to meet both of these burdens. We're honored to oppose. We thank you to do the same.
In this debate, where the ends are as big as 680 million people being lifted out of poverty, we do not believe that we should be talking about means. We believe that we have set our burdens straight and that we have framed this debate right from the start, and that if side opposition is to win this debate, they have to prove that they do not support the rise of China and that it better had not have happened. This is what has to be done in this debate for their side. In my speech, firstly, I'm going to refute all of their points. We're going to talk about all of the rebuttal done on our first two arguments, and then we're going to introduce our third argument, talking to you about how China actually is excellent at dealing with the third world, how China has great investments and great methods, especially when compared with other countries which actually try to make the same thing, but they never actually do it. So, to start it all off, with this frame, as explained at the start, we believe that the means here are not to be debated, because the ends you have to deal with ends. Because China, you have to understand, is a huge country. They currently have 1.3 billion people, and that's literally 1/7 of the population. And we have those people which are actually in poverty, which were actually starving, slaving away, doing things for nothing. And now, even if they do have low wages, even if they do have low human rights, it's still better off than being absolutely poor and having nothing. And even if the means to achieve that, no thank you, even if the means to achieve that are questionable, we believe that the ends are big enough and that the benefits are huge enough for us to say that this is okay. Because when you take a look at a country, no thank you, that goes developing by good means, take a look at India. India is very similar to China, except that 50 years ago, it chose democracy instead of autocracy. And now, China is light years ahead of the same India. India now has more infantile deaths, it has 5 times the rate of malnutrition, no thank you, and it has double the smaller GDP. So it literally has half the GDP that China now has because it has chosen this means to develop. And we believe that this is what actually proves our side. So to start, on our first argument, they said that yes, China has lifted people out of poverty, but this is absolutely not relative poverty, which is first of all not to explain that I don't get what they're talking about, because you do lift people out of poverty once they can buy food. No thank you. If they can buy food, I don't care if it gets more expensive, if they can still buy it, and this attack says nothing. After that, they said that the middle class is once again growing only due to artificial stimulus, but without explaining why this is bad. We know that China is an autocratic regime, and yes, of course, it manages its economy. It is not 100% for the free market. It has some methods with which it controls its economy, but if this is good, if this means that the middle class is still rising, why should we care that this is artificial stimulus if it's obviously doing something good? After that, they told us that slavery is a thing in China. All the factories and all the things are cheap because they use slavery. And when asked, okay, which factories? Oh, literally every one. So we might as well say that yes, we might as well say anything in this debate without having the actual data to back it up. Also, second argument, talking about geopolitical stability, they once again said that China uses economic leverage on countries and that China does some bad things. But we see right now that China, even though that it does have the power, even though that it is a giant, it still roots for peace and stability in the world, and it does not use this economic leverage. Of course, a powerful country has the potential to do some harm to other countries, but in this case, it's obviously not doing so. No, thank you. And we believe that it's okay, it has economic leverage, but it's not using it to harm people. After that, they introduced their first point talking about the decline of social good. Where firstly they say that China poses an existential threat because they still trade with some countries, they still give money to some countries which have dictators in place. And what we're trying to tell you here is firstly this will be later explained in China in the third world. And the second thing, this does not necessarily mean that they legitimize the regime. They just recognize that the people need some help and send the humanitarian aid and send the money. Sure.
When you give aid directly to dictators who are corrupt, what you do is support them and allow them to stay in power for longer. That's legitimizing them.
Okay, giving somebody money does not necessarily mean legitimizing their cause. We're just saying your people are unhappy, your people have nothing to eat, here have some money, deliver something to them, make some progress. So, they said that China poses an existential threat because they give money to dictators, and secondly, because they trade with everybody, even those countries. And we see that yes, even though China cooperates with all those countries, this means that China is crazy enough to be a mediator. China is crazy enough to sit up all the dictators at one table, and we have saw that example just recently, because China has actually gotten the leaders of North and South Korea to sit at the same table, which those two people were not able to do without the power of China, without it rising. So after that, they said, ooh, their people didn't consent to the rise, therefore it's an illegitimate and bad rise. I don't care if their people don't consent to being lifted out of poverty. The fact that they're lifted out of poverty is a good thing. They don't have to consent to the regime just has to give them some benefit in order to be good, in order for us to support that same regime. And after that, they talk about political aggression and they talk about the main example, so Tiananmen Square. And yes, we agree. Tiananmen Square was a horrible thing, it should never be repeated, but it was done back in the far days, no thank you, back in the far days of 1989. Since then, China has made some progress on human rights. Since then, China has realized that it can't just kill its own people, and no thank you, and it can't just send tanks out on students. It has realized what the good thing is, and China has recently even made some efforts, such as its industries, such as the Foxconn, which makes Apple stuff. The factory has actually agreed to raise its minimum wage because of the pressure. So we see that China is taking a step in the right direction. And now talking about our third substantive point, talking about how China actually interferes with the third world and what China does. Now we see that because China has this policy of never propagating its ideology on other countries, China is actually very successful at dealing with these third world countries, at giving them infrastructure and at giving them profit, at actually making them prosper. Because China does not care if you are a dictator, China only looks at your people. And Chinese people do not do diplomacy the same way the Western people do diplomacy. No, thank you. They do not need the state heads to agree. They just say, okay, we can cooperate on a long-term plan. And this is actually being done because China has multi-billion-dollar projects in Africa. And this is actually just recently has pledged $2 billion to a humanitarian aid fund and has said that it agrees to increase the same fund to $16 billion in the next tens of years. So we see that China is taking a step in the right direction and actually thinking long term, giving cheap loans, funding infrastructure projects, and we all know just recently what the Asian Development Bank has been doing. It has been giving money to all of those countries in Asia and actually letting them develop, giving out cheap loans and not doing what the Western countries have been doing with this same area, because what they have been doing is outsourcing their companies, so putting their factories there, and also thinking very short term and intervening into political systems. We all think that Syria or Libya would have been better off if we had just built infrastructure instead of going on to kill the leader first. And this is a much smarter move, and this is what China actually does. So, in my speech today, I have proven to you that yes, the opposition needs to prove that the rise of China never should have happened. Because we cannot talk about the means when the ends are actually lives of million people. And because China has successfully lifted 680 million people out of poverty, because China is actively promoting a policy of never actually interfering into others, of never actually doing anything that you don't want, because China has excellent economic policy and is a nation which loves stability, we should promote the rise of China and we should support the rise of China.
So today I'd like to pose a quick question to our esteemed panel of judges. If side opposition told you that they were going to build a bridge with slave labor, would you support it? Probably not. Morally, we as human beings have a problem with slavery. So why then is it all right for them to stand up and say that it's okay to build a country, an economy, off of slave labor? On the bodies of people who died in Tiananmen Square, on the backs of people who suffer under wage slavery, and the onboard babies who died during the one-child policy. This is what we do not support on side opposition. These are integral parts of the rise of China. What we say when we clarify this point is that it has to be shown on the side of the proposition why all of the things that's happening in China were necessary to this amazing growth that they're talking about. I'm going to be doing a few things in this speech. The first is establishing a little bit of rebuttal to what we've heard so far from the proposition. The second, working to reinforce and expand on what Millen told you in the first speech. And the third, I'm going to introduce the last substantive argument given to you by the proposition that this creates an unstable and unsustainable growth for China. Now, let's look at this central narrative that we hear out of side proposition. The first part is that 680 million people are magically lifted out of poverty. They never tell you how this occurs, so I'm going to go into a little depth with you. China purposely suppresses its wages. Its people could be making quite a lot more. When Millen tells you that quite a few factories in China utilize slavery, it's important to recognize we're talking about wage slavery. People who are kept at very low wages so that they have no choice but to work. This is the only way where China is able to outcompete the rest of the world. And we might add that all in balance, what that means is that the jobs that are in China now would have gone to somewhere else in the world. You wouldn't have slavery on the other end. You would still have cheap goods. So even if you buy into side proposition's misguided method, showing that somehow we need to have an ends-based decision, it's not like this doesn't happen in either world. Moreover, what they're telling you is that this 680 million jobs somehow means that we get a middle class. And at first that sounds great, but in their own analysis they tell you that that means people are buying more. And effectively what that means is we get a larger inflation. So yes, instead of making $1 a day, 680 million people around China make $2 a day, which would be great, except for the costs also double. So it's not like people are too far better in China. This is something that they fail to respond to on the side of the opposition. The next thing they say is that this is good for world trade. Again, we recognize that the economy is not net zero. Does China not rise? That doesn't mean that we live in a world where those jobs aren't created, where that trade doesn't occur. It just goes to places where it's needed more. People who still live in poverty in areas like Africa, in those same countries that they talk about China trying to protect. Which brings us to the next bit of the narrative for this rise of China proposition. That it's beneficial to the rest of the world. But first.
The economy doesn't work like that. There aren't end jobs to be filled. The amount of consumers, the amount of infrastructure, this all affects economy.
Absolutely. The economy is interconnected, which is why it's very hard for us to believe that those 680 million jobs made in China wouldn't have been made elsewhere if it didn't rise. Even if we do subscribe to your absurd burden, there's no evidence to suggest that there's going to be any kind of change in either world. We just don't get that analysis from the proposition. Just finished answering your BLI. Moreover, on this geopolitics narrative, what they tell you is that China acts to make the world more peaceful. But we hear analysis from Millen saying that when they talk about China trying to block the Western world from bombing, it's not to make the world more peaceful. It's to keep regimes like Bashar al-Assad in Syria in power, allowing them to kill millions of people in a civil war and to allow millions more to be fleeing as refugees into Europe and around the world. This is what China supports. No, China is not supporting humanitarianism. China China is trying to support its own political ends. China is trying to support a world where it's able to gain the most resources from it. Furthermore, what's the narrative that we give you on the proposition? What we tell you is very simple. We say, first of all, China hinders social development around the world. And that social development comes from when China funds these dictators, they legitimize them. Why? Because this stuff doesn't come from China, it comes from the dictators. The people say, oh, my dictator is doing this to me, and then they don't depose them. It allows the dictator to be legitimized in the eyes of the people, just giving them one symbol of growth as opposed to actual liberalization. Keep in mind the same policies that led to China's growth, those liberalization policies, aren't being allowed by China in the world of the proposition. Furthermore, we tell you about how we have these problems like censorship. We tell you about how they're able to block all of these wonderful rights that come to humanity. What we ask you is, why was that necessary? That brings us to the second part of the opposition narrative. And that's that you have this massive oppression on the part of the rise of China. Here we have the Tiananmen protests, and the question that we pose to the proposition's next speaker is, why are the Tiananmen protests necessary to the rise of China? They themselves said it's nothing that we should be supporting, that shouldn't be repeated. But if we don't think it should be repeated, then why are we supporting it? Why are we openly telling to the global community that it's okay, that on balance, Tiananmen was fine, and we should just let it happen again so that other people can emulate China's rise to power? The third part of the central narrative, however, is key. This is the last substantive point that we give you as the opposition, and that's that this growth is unstable and unsustainable. Two layers of analysis here. Firstly, environmentally. What we tell you is that the rise of China means that they've gone from consuming 500 million tons of oil to 2.5 in just a short period of time. Since 2000, their coal consumption is up by 171%. This is highly unsustainable because it doesn't allow us any sort of means of checking the huge environmental costs felt by people in China. The pollution that kills millions each year there. The Chinese government does nothing to stop it. They may say that yes, they were at the climate talks, but keep in mind, China labored highly so that we wouldn't have any legal binding on these climate talks. They hindered them. And so China, again, as part of the geopolitical sphere, doesn't help it. It hinders it to get to its own means. The second layer of analysis here is that it's economically unsustainable. And this is key, because China should have stopped growing in the year 2000. What actually ends up happening is China supports its economic growth by just spending money and collecting debt. Now 90% of China's growth is financed by government debt, and they've taken on $1.74 trillion in debt, 540 billion of which is considered bad debt, something they can't repay. This is why people only bet on China in the short term, because they recognize that betting in the long term means there's an inevitable crash. So when we talk about this, we have to recognize that there's an economic bubble which China is placed on. And when it pops, all of the 680 million people that they lift out of poverty go right back. This is the key thing. Even if you don't buy the fact that they have to justify the means, keep in mind that the ends they're talking about in the long run are far more limited. This is why we have never been more proud to oppose.
What this motion does not require us to do is come here and tell you that everything that China ever did was good for the world. What this motion does not require us to do is that say that Tiananmen Square was a great act of humanity, and we will not stand by this and we will never stand by this. What this motion requires us to do is to tell you that the process of the rise of China had more good than bad. That the rise of China made the world a better place, despite the bad things that happened, despite the problems that happened. And why are we saying that China made the world a better place? What are we saying that they are barely contesting? We have clearly told you that the rise of China has brought prosperity and peace to the world. That China helped during the economic crash. That China is building massive infrastructure in the kind of African countries. That China is blocking military intervention. That China is not deciding its foreign policy on whether the political system suits it, but because it wants necessary. We have clearly explained to you why China is a force that wants the world to to be economically stable, that wants to trade partners in the world, and we have shown you why this is in China's interest, why China is in the world a force for peace and prosperity. And yes, we believe that when we are talking about the developed world, the developing world, it's really hard to talk about human rights. It's really hard to talk about things like fair trials, because these things, whether or not a country is democratic, don't in practice happen. India is a democratic country. It has more human rights abuses than China. You're more likely to get murdered in India than you are in China, no thank you. You're more likely to get raped, you're more likely to be killed while you're being born. So yes, we believe that the effect of China has been positive. We believe that this rise has been positive. Now, on that point, yes please.
What you're defending in this debate is basically just economic growth is good. You're just trying to define us out of it, and we won't stand for that.
No, we're claiming that peace and prosperity are good. We're claiming that China is a force for peace and prosperity. And yes, we believe that bringing infrastructure and money into the developing world, into African countries, into India and into China is important and is good. So yes, we are debating that economic development is good. Now, on the issue of the Chinese economy, they claim that China has slave labor. No, China has bad labor rights laws, yes. But bad labor rights laws are better than no job. Bad labor rights laws are better than no infrastructure, than no middle class. Comparatively when compared to other developing nations, compared to countries that started from the same place that China started 50 years ago, yes, workers have it better in China. No, it's not perfect. No, it's not a good thing, but it's obviously the better growth model. It's obviously the model that makes people well. It's obviously the model that makes people wealthier. So, no, thank you. And when they say that when you have a larger middle class, you have inflation, yes, inflation is a thing that happens on modern markets. Every market in the world has inflation. Inflation is a good thing. Too much inflation is a bad thing, but we don't see too much inflation happening in China. They haven't shown us any number why this inflation will be relevant. So yes, a little inflation is always a good thing, and it's something that grows markets. So yes, we believe, no thank you. So yes, they have told you that the work conditions in China are bad. And we have told you the work conditions everywhere are bad. But the Chinese ones are better. And China trades with everybody, increasing the life standard and life quality of everybody, giving everyone advancements, no thank you, giving everyone cheaper loans, and giving everyone the ability to survive and develop. Now, when we talk about that these jobs that came in China would have happened anywhere, shows a critical misunderstanding of how economy works. Because the amount of jobs in a country is not fixed. It's not like Africa has N jobs and Europe has N jobs and the amount of goods that need to be produced by the world are N. This is a very fluid process, and it depends on how much infrastructure you have. It depends on how well organized you are. It depends on how developed you are. Because yes, theoretically, we could have a world where everyone has everything. But the economy is a complex process. And the fact that China is built, no, these jobs would not exist anywhere in the world. China is not stealing work because the wages in China are higher than the wages in Africa. If it was just about wages and just about stealing work, all the jobs would be in Africa. China has built an infrastructure and made the world a wealthier and richer place. Made sure that food is cheaper, made sure that products are cheaper, and in this way made sure that people of the world are more prosperous, made sure that people of the world have the ability to eat. So yes, we believe that China is a major force of prosperity in this world. No thank you. Now, when it comes to peace, they tell us that China supports dictators. And we agree, China finances dictators. But can we look at the alternative? Look at how much good not supporting the dictators has done to the people of Syria. Look how much good not supporting dictators has done to the people of Iraq. Look how much good not supporting dictators has done to the country of Africa. China trades with everyone. China deals with everyone. China deals with everyone, no matter their political regime. Yes, please.
The only reason there's still a dictator in Syria is because China consistently supports them in the UN Security Council.
The reason there's a dictator in Syria is because he's a powerful military dictator, because he's hard to take down. It's not only because of China's support, it's not only because of China's troops. If only thing we could add that it's also because of Russia's troops and Russia's weapons, so it's not only China. But look, The fact is you can't eradicate dictators from the world. You can't eradicate evil in the world. What you can do is make the world more prosperous and more peaceful. Because China is the only country in the world that has nuclear weapons and promises not to be the first one to launch them. We believe that China is a force for peace. We believe that yes, building a canal in Africa, building infrastructure in Africa, building roads in Africa, even if it's for your own purpose, even if it's for your own trade, is much more important than taking care of the dictators. Because we believe that when we have prosperity, that democracy is an amazing thing. But peace and prosperity come first. The ability to feed, the ability to be not shot down in the street, these are things that come first. And this is the way China makes the world a better place. And now, on to their third point, on to their last point about unsustainability. Okay. Right, first I want to analyze the environmental harm because this is a very popular argument. China is the world's biggest polluter. And yes, when you look at it theoretically, China is the world's biggest polluter. But the thing that pollutes a lot more, the thing that has the most impact on pollution is consumption. And just because all the unclean industries moved from Europe and the United States to China does not mean that China is making the world a much dirtier place. Because these goods are mostly consumed by Europeans and Americans. And if you want to make the world a cleaner place, you start with consumption. Because these things will be made somewhere. If China ups their environmental standards, these factories will be made somewhere. If China ups their environmental standards, these things will still need to be produced. Because clean industry is not the only solution to the problem of environmentalism. And to the fact that its economy is unstable, the only example to why China's economy is unstable is that it has foreign debt. Well, can you name me one country in the world that does not have foreign debt? Foreign debt is also a part of the economy, just like inflation, and something that happens. China's economy is still the fastest growing economy in the world. It still has the largest growing middle class in the world, and it is a stable growing economy. Just because it has debt does not make it, because this debt is a minimal part of China's GDP, unlike the US, debt which is 80% of the US GDP. So, because China is a force for peace and prosperity, because peace and prosperity unfortunately come before workers' rights and democracy, because China has made everyone in the world better, because no workers' rights are better than no job, and because China is a force, yes, we think the rise of China was a good process.
A rise without the consent of the people is no rise at all. A rise that was built on the backs of suppressing wages for the purpose of creating the illusion that there is economic growth. A rise that was built on the backs of cultural erasure and oppression and a culture of misogyny is not a rise that we should support. Because we believe that Team Proposition is trying to put band-aids on the bullet wounds of cultural erasure and oppression throughout China's history, we are proud to oppose today's motion that this House would support the rise of China. In this speech, I'm going to be doing a couple of things. First, I'm going to be talking about some framing arguments. The idea of this definitional debate of what it actually means to support the rise of China. Next, I'm going to be going on to offer you some key questions you should ask yourself when evaluating this round. Is the economic growth of China really that sustainable? And second, are the investments of China in the outside world actually helping these countries to increase in their economic growth as well? But first, on the idea of the framing of this round. We say that Team Proposition is fundamentally misconstruing what it means to have a rise of China. A rise is a holistic process that takes place over a period of time. It is not a finite, isolated group of incidences that they can just pigeonhole themselves into and say, look, these individual things are good. We say that Team Proposition has to say that the means by which China arrived at these consequences is a good thing. They cannot divorce China from their history of all these problems of cultural erasure, of oppression, and the suppression of wages. We also say that because they cannot actually specify when the rise started and began, you have to also, the reasonable position to confer the idea of a holistic rise. Yes?
Do you believe that the French Revolution was good, despite the fact that its means were killing people?
We say that you have to always look at the means before you arrive at the ends. Take the United States with slavery, for example. Yeah, white Southern plantation owners benefited a lot from the system of slavery, but we fundamentally reject the fact that slavery was something that was oppressive and bad. This is the same thing that's happening inside proposition. We cannot say that, oh, if I'm going to eliminate all of your student debt, but I do that by robbing all of your friends, that's not morally permissible under any side of the world. We reject that notion, and we say that team proposition has to defend China's holistic rise. Again, we say that they cannot divorce themselves from this before-after binary of a rise that is solely based in good economic consequences and not the history of cultural oppression. They have to tell you why the steps China took was necessary to get to the point that they are at right now. I encourage these gentlemen to stand up here and support the policies of the one-child policy, to support the idea of suppressing wages for the purpose of actually inflating prices. No, thank you. So, because of that, let's move on to the next question. Is economic growth even sustainable at all? Their last speaker doesn't even nearly touch the economic bubble argument that Josh very eloquently set up for you in his last speech, so let me explain it. China should have stagnated in its growth in 2000. However, 90% of that growth comes from government stimulus or fixed assets investments. What this does is it allows China to inflate its prices while lowering its wages to bid off the illusion that there's this economic prosperity. Okay, so this creates an economic bubble that is eventually going to pop. This is why we see the housing market prices increase by 150%. Okay? When this economic bubble pops, and it eventually will, because 90% economic stimulus growth coming from artificial investment is not going to be sustainable, this has detrimental effects for the Chinese economy, for all these people that they're claiming they got lifted out of poverty, and all the people who have investments in the Chinese economy. People who are in debt to China, this is just going to obliterate other nations that are invested in the Chinese economy. There was not enough analysis coming out of team government on the actual link chain of how this bubble actually evolved and actually eventually burst. The second issue on the economic sustainability is idea of poverty. They fundamentally do not understand the difference between relative poverty and absolute poverty. If I make two-word one that I did yesterday, that may mean that I am relatively more out of poverty, but that doesn't mean I am out of absolute poverty. The idea that they're just going to stand up here and champion the number 680 million is a palliative for the fact that these people are not actually being lifted out of permanent poverty. It's simply giving the illusion because China is suppressing its wages due to this economic bubble that has been based on fixed assets investments. They fundamentally do not engage in the analysis of this argument. So, is China economically sustainable? No. Is this growth something we should support? No. Did they arrive by this by suppressing wages on the pretense they're actually trying to help people? Yes. Are they actually bringing people out of absolute poverty, or is it just relative poverty? Relative poverty. The next question. Are other countries actually benefiting or are they hurt by China's economic policy? Here's what we tell you. Other countries lose money when they are investing in China because China has this race to the bottom with its wages. Why do you think the prices for Chinese cheap goods are so cheap in the first place? It's because the wages are so suppressed that it allows them for other countries to buy into these cheap products, which is actually detrimental because when this economic bubble collapses, it's a collateral damage effect. It's not going to actually end up being beneficial in the long run. Additionally, we tell you that the idea of economic coercion, they just ignore the fact that China, when Kenya did not agree with the economic policies of China, China literally shut off their power for a week via means of economic coercion. Even though this is not China directly trying to attack them with certain policies or invading with the military, we believe that this is not a morally permissible policy that China should just be given free rein to go in and actually coerce other nations. Yes?
Does economic intervention, economic forcing of something kill people?
Does economic intervention kill people? Well, when you shut off the power of a Kenyan nation that needs power like hospitals and other industries, I'd say that yes, there was probably a lot of lives lost in that. They say that it's okay to go ahead and give aid to other dictators if it's going to be supporting infrastructure in that country. We reject the idea that when China goes in and gives aid to dictators, they're suddenly going to hold themselves accountable and become benevolent and use that for appropriate needs. They're putting too much trust in the hands of these international leaders to actually use the resources that China is allocating them for good purposes. Again, they do not interact with the arguments brought up by Millen in the first speech, how in Syria, China actually used their economic coercion of actually intervening in that area, they ignore this. So, at the end of the debate, what do you have? We say that team proposition is trying to get out of substantively engaging in fundamental framing of what this debate should be about. The rise of China cannot be divided into a single isolated incident of good economic outcomes. The rise of China is something that has happened over a holistic period of time, and they cannot divorce China from the negative steps it has taken to actually achieve their ends. The ends are not the only thing that matters in this instance. We also have to look at the means. On team opposition, we tell you that the means are morally impermissible, but we also interact on the economic level of this debate. When they do not provide sufficient analysis on the economic bubble argument, they do not interact enough with the idea of wage suppression. They simply want to tout this number of 680 million around when they don't understand the principles of fundamental relative and absolute poverty. For all these reasons, and the fundamental narrow view of team government, we beg you to reject it.
The debate we saw today was supposed to be a debate about the means and ends, where these were built upon. But we tell you that the means by which China built its rise was on the backs of wage slavery, on the backs of pollution, on the backs of stealing money, on the backs of coercion, and on the backs of the people that it was trying to support at the end of the day. This is the problem with proposition stance, and they never engage with this. 2 questions in this speech. Are the ends of their policy good? Second question, is the means by which China achieved its rise good? But first, one strategic error by the proposition. We told you at the very beginning of this debate, and contested their definition, that they had discussed both the means and the ends. Because this wasn't a debate questioning whether or not the rise of China made the world a better place. It was a debate about whether or not we would support the rise of China. Think of it this way. When a wealthy banker embezzles money to put food on the table for his family, do we support that? No, because although the end was good, he didn't justify it in the means. We would rather have someone who works an honest living, doesn't embezzle money, and maybe takes in less money at the end of the day. That's what we mean by support. The means can't be divorced by the ends, and that's what they do on side proposition. First question, were the ends good? A large majority of their case was based on poverty. But we clearly told you, all that they say they sought for is absolute poverty. They never engage with our analysis on relative poverty. All that they say is, well, maybe it's a little bit of inflation. No, that's not the case. Inflation outpaced the growth in wages. That's why people aren't coming out of poverty, only absolute poverty. Then secondly, they talked about the middle class. But we clearly told you, the middle class's growth is built on a bubble. When this bubble pops in the future, because 90% of China's debt is fixed asset investment from their own country, it's very unstable and it's not going to last for very long. So although the middle class may be growing now, it's not going to be sustainable in the future. They don't have an ends-based argument there. Then they talk to you about loans to other countries. They talk to you about exporting to other countries and how that's a good thing for China. But we already responded to that by saying this is taking money out of other countries' economies. This is particularly bad when they cite the example of 2008, the financial crisis, when countries needed this money the most in their own economy and China was offering cheap goods. They never responded to that. Then we talked to you about Africa. And they said that in Sudan, China did great things. But we said, no, you're legitimizing a horrible regime there by giving that regime support. They said, well, money doesn't equate to support. What does that mean? If you're giving money to a dictator, you're supporting them, you're legitimizing them. We think that's fairly simple. Then they told you about countries like Syria, or we told you about countries like Syria. And we said China blocked actively UN effort to curtail despotism there. No response from the proposition. Finally, we told you about economic coercion. Perhaps the worst and egregious error on side proposition. We told you, in countries like Kenya, yes, they might not use their military power to coerce them, but they use their economic power. When you invest in infrastructure and turn off the lights to demonize people, to kill people in hospitals, to make their lives worse, just so these countries follow your policies, that's not a good thing, and certainly, even if we're looking at the end, they're not winning this debate. Secondly, let's look to the means. We talked to you about wage slavery today. They said, well, can you name companies where this happens? We say wages are low all across China. We say that in certain circumstances, particularly just holistically look at China. Why are the goods so cheap there? This is basic economics. Because companies pay their workers less, that's why they're able to push prices down artificially. They never responded to that analysis. Secondly, we talked about Tiananmen Square, and they fully conceded it. They said, yeah, Tiananmen Square is horrible. We hope that never happens. But Tiananmen Square isn't divorced from the rise of China. It was a means by which it happened. They never engaged with that. Then we talked about the one-child policy. We said it was with the rise of China that the one-child policy came about. No analysis from side proposition. Finally, we talked about pollution. And they said, well, the West pollutes too, and China's got these industries from the West. So what? If the West pollutes, we think that's a bad thing. China polluting more, and just because the West pollutes, this doesn't justify China polluting even more. They fundamentally made a mistake in this debate. You can never divorce the means of an action from the ends of it. And because we don't support the words of Machiavelli, and we don't support the words of the proposition, or the rise of China, we're honored to oppose and beg you all to do the same.
4 speeches ago, side opposition practically summarized their entire strategy this match by asking one question. Would you support a bridge built by slave labor? And of course, the quick answer is no, because you don't think about it. You don't think about what's on the other side. You don't think about the context. All you think about is this concrete fact that this concrete bridge was built by slave labor. What if I tell you that this same bridge is being used by 1.3 billion people to get the food on the other side? Is this bridge okay now? Is this bridge still bad just inherently because it was built by slaves, or is it actually a good thing that now involves the prosperity of 1.3 billion people? And this was the strategy of side proposition. We have proven to you that yes, even though the means were questionable, the ends were great enough and the ends were good enough that we can actually say that yes, the means are questionable, but this is a good rise and this is a rise that we should support. So in this reply speech, we talk about 3 different stakeholders. First off, China's population, second, the civilized world, and thirdly, the third world. So, the first point, what happens with China's population? China's population of now 1.3 billion people is fed. It may not be the happiest, it may not have the biggest number of human rights, and people in France might be better off. But these people are now well fed. These people now actually have a job, even though it's a low-wage job. And they're generally better off with the China that has risen than with the China which has, let's say, chosen the democratic path, like India has, and has now ended up in a pretty bad place, where it is economically strong, but its people have basically nothing. So China's growth has done good for the Chinese population, and they're a lot better off than if this growth had not happened. And this is the first reason we support the rise of China. Second stakeholder, the civilized world. What happens with the Western nations? So the Western nations can now trade with China, first thing. They can get good cheap products, they can outsource labor, they can trade with China, they can make pacts with China, they can actually have international relationships, and they have a good strong neighbor on the other side that they can trade with, that they can make economic policies with, so the Western world profits. After that, the civilized world now also has a geopolitical stabilizer, as China has a policy of not intervening, has a policy of really liking peace, because it has to trade. China does not like to intervene, China does not like to change political systems. China likes peace and China likes stability. So everybody profits because such a huge, such a major player, such a strong force in the world is not bombing anybody and is just rooting for peace and stability in the world in whichever way we can achieve it. So by the second stakeholder, once again, we approve the motion because China's rise has contributed to the good and well-being of the civilized world. And the last point, what happens to the third world? I think that throughout this whole debate, we have proven that China's approach is a lot healthier. And whilst they do legitimize dictators sometimes, whilst they do trade with them sometimes, this is still overall a good thing, because China does not see this dictator as a firewall, as a wall which blocks them from helping the population. The guy at the head of the state might be bad, but the population does not deserve to suffer even more just because this guy is at the head of the state. And countries like the US, countries of the EU are too proud to look to the other side and just give money, just make sure the people prosper, because they're too afraid of being called a dictator or legitimizer or whatever you might call such a person. So, throughout this whole debate, we have proven to you that we don't have to look at the means because the ends are great enough, because we do have enough benefits, because China's rise has brought us economic prosperity, has brought us geopolitical stability, has done wonders to the third world, and has done wonders to the 1.3 billion people actually living in China. So for all these reasons, we beg you to propose, we beg you to propose.